Hello, this is Sam Gerrans from samgerrans.com. Today is Monday, May 22nd, 2023, and today the subject is total propaganda. Now, this isn't hyperbole, it's actually a fact, because we're looking today at this book, which is Propaganda by Jacques Ellul, or Jacques Ellul, depending on how you say it. And because it's Monday, this is a long-form presentation, part of which is going to be on YouTube, and the rest of it, the majority of it, is going to be on my Substack for my paid subscribers. Now, the way it works, I know that everybody in internet world thinks that everything's free, and you get emails saying, "Oh, perhaps you could pass this on to your team." Well, there is no team. There's just me and it's work, you see, and that's all fine. But the way it works is this: is either you support me or I go away. Simple as that. Now, the people who are on my Substack who have paid to my Substack, and it's I think it's $10 a month. They are helping me, but other people are not, and so I'm going to have to change things up. So I'll give it another week or so. But if it doesn't change, if I don't get any donations, I'll just take that as a sign that I'm going to do fewer videos a week, and I'll use my time in other ways. I'll still be making the Monday ones for my Substack, but it's just how it is. So anyway, let's just jump into it. So total propaganda. We're looking at this stage of his book, which is on page 9. And I'd just like to point out that this book was written the English edition was written in 1965. So I think the French came out in 1964. And that's important. If you think about it, that's nearly 60 years ago that this book was written, and all the things that it says are obviously he was writing for that time. This is a pre-internet world. This book was written on a typewriter, if not by hand, but certainly on a typewriter. It wasn't written on a word processor. There was no internet. He wasn't Googling stuff. So this is how this book was written. It was written at a time of the Cold War. And you hear a lot of people talking now today about the wonders of the multipolar world and sort of embracing it and applauding it. They seem to have forgotten that we had a multipolar world not so long ago, and that was called the Cold War, and lots of people died under it, even when the world was all divided up into these neat little parcels. At least ostensibly, millions died in millions. Many tens of millions were murdered by the Soviet regime. Many tens of millions were murdered by the Maoist regime. I don't know how many millions exactly, but lots were murdered by the Western democracies. The difference being there, of course, they were murdered in other countries or other places. So not much has changed, and I don't suppose much will change. I'm going to miss a few bits of this. Now, the reason why I'm doing this is because this book, and he has another book called The Technological Society, which is, I think, called La Technique in the French, and the reason why I mention that is because the word technological rather misses something in English. It's about technique and technology, although technology is a part of technique and technology are not synonymous. And the reason why I mention this is because technique and propaganda go hand in hand, and I highly recommend everybody read these two books. If you read nothing else, these two books will explain to you a whole lot about what's going on, what's always been going on actually, but what's going on in our time, and why, if you feel, angst-ridden and lost and as if nothing makes sense and you're living in a big lie, you are living in a big lie, but this will give you some way of explaining it without having to take recourse to, say, for example, either religious precepts, moral precepts, anything like that, because people can argue about those, but it's very difficult to argue with this, and that's why I go through it. Now, the trouble is of course that Mr. Ellul was an academic, and it can be a problem for some people, especially given that we're not really very good at reading anymore because we've been dumbed down. We all have. It's an inevitable consequence of using screens and all of this. And he writes in a rather a sort of dense, rather turgid, sometimes tedious way. Doesn't sound like a bit of a hard sell, much of a hard sell, but he's really writing. He has to cover all of his bases. He's dealing with other academics, and he can't just write in a yo-bro kind of style, although I'm not going to render it quite into that. But if I can break it down and give you some illustrations of it, it'll make it seem more relevant, I hope, at least. Anyway, before we get into all of that, just to say, I'm going to skip some the more boring bits or the less relevant bits. But my recommendation is to read it for yourself. Read it slowly. Just read one section a day and go through it slowly. This isn't meme reading. It's not email reading. It's worth going through slowly and thinking about. Anyway, before I get into that, I want to just summarize what we mean by technique and the fact that propaganda is an integral part of technique. In fact, it's not only necessary for technique to operate in order for technique to become the dominant religion, which it is. It is the only religion now in the world, and this is why I say there's no difference between a multipolar and a unipolar world, because they both have the same religion, and that religion, I'm going to summarize it. It is technique. And technique, what is technique? Well, technique is really a religion of utility, materialism, and pragmatism. We've always had a certain amount of those things, but our forefathers had this thing called tradition and religion and history and allegiance to land, blood, faith, these sorts of things. Well, technique doesn't care about any of that, because it can't use them. Well, I mean, it can use them in propaganda terms, but they are inefficient. And what technique wants ultimately, in fact, ultimately, technique doesn't want you at all, and it's certainly going to get rid of as many of you as possible. If you haven't noticed, that seems to be the agenda. But in the meantime, it's going to keep you around, and it's going to atomize you. That's what's happening. It's going to divorce you from any connection to any of the things I've just mentioned, and leave you and the state on a one-to-one sort of level. That's what it does, because that's more efficient. It doesn't want anybody between you and the state. So it's a form of tyranny. In fact, it is tyranny. It's a much sort of tyranny 2.0, the new and improved tyranny. Now, it's all based on 4 basic presuppositions, which are the presuppositions of modernity, which you will find on page 39 of Ilal's technique. And before I get into that, the reason why, again, I'm using this book is because if you know my broader work, my previous work, the work for which I suppose I'm best known, and which extended over 8 years, this is based on a scripture, and it's work with scripture, with the Quran in this case. Now, the problem is that you can't. It's fine to use this as your sort of foundational baseline when you're dealing with other people who accept that as a premise, but or attempt to argue using it with people who don't accept religion or the Quran or whatever it is. This is different. It means that I can use this in order to engage with people who are intelligent but perhaps don't have a religious point of view or no interest in the kind of work that I've done previously. So that's really why it is. Now, the 4 basic presuppositions of technique, which are the 4 postulates which everybody believes, everybody who lives within, well, not everybody, you'll find individual exceptions, but every country, every society which lives under technique, which is everywhere apart from maybe somebody in the Amazon rainforest, everybody else believes is based on 4 basic postulates. And then you're thinking, oh no, that's not going to be true. But actually it is true. And here's the first one. The first one is that man's aim in life is happiness. That everybody believes that. And that's actually the point. That if you look at the American Constitution, the pursuit of happiness, this is a basic right. This is something that we all believe. This is part of our worldview, which if you are subscribe to my Substack and able to watch all of this, you'll see that worldview is utterly central. It's what propaganda is really aiming to create. So this is already created. These are here as pre-installed with anybody in the world who knows what an iPhone is. Okay, everybody. That the man's aim in life is happiness. That's the first one. And you can't question this. That your actual point is to be happy. Of course, happiness is ill-defined or never defined, but you kind of know it when you see it. But it's a fleeting emotion, and it's associated with something called love. But what is love? And the Greeks had 3 words for it. Okay, but we've only got one, and blah blah blah. All of that. Okay, but anyway, you kind of feel you have a right to be happy, and the reason why you feel you have a right to be happy is to do with the second postulate, which is of technique, of modernity, of everything which exists since electricity was invented, I suppose, is that man is naturally good. Everyone believes this. Everyone believes it. We're all good. That's why I'll get into some of the development of this. The third is that history develops in endless progress. You've heard about progress all your life. You believe in progress. Everybody does. Excuse me. Everyone believes in progress. iPhone 10 is better than an iPhone 1. But there you are. Progress. Who can argue with that? And the last one is that everything is matter. Now, just to kind of put these into more culturally digestible tablet form. So man's aim in life is happiness. This basically, this entire philosophy, and it's a philosophy, it's written about by philosophers in great long boring books that most of us couldn't possibly read anymore or would want to read. But it can be summarized as YOLO. All right, that's it. You only live once. There you are. That's your answer. That's the justification. Or do what thou wilt if you're going to be, a bit more intellectual about it. Aleister Crowley, but essentially, Aleister Crowley was a large, was a part of this. But I'm not talking here about conspiracies or anything like that. I'm just talking about what it is you believe, and you do believe it ultimately. If you have access to anything that can watch me on this saying this, you believe it probably. The second one is man is essentially good. Well, this is where we get entitlement from. I deserve this entitlement. So that's the next one. And everyone believes this. We're trained into this idea. History develops in endless progress. Well, progress is a cult, and as I say, technological progress, if you can call it progress, but you'd have to define where you were going for progress to mean anything. Where are you going? Where are you going? Exactly. So you can have no progress until you have an actual endpoint, and you've never thought about the endpoint. In fact, technique is all about never thinking about the endpoint. That's why progress is actually meaningless within that context at least. And the last one is everything is matter, which is where we get the Big Bang theory, evolution, and all the rest of it. And it's a religion. You have to believe it. I won't go into this in great detail. I have done in other places, but actually our forefathers, the people whose societies we actually pine for, we do pine for them. That's why we're living in this sense that we have this sense of angst. They didn't believe any of these. Most of them didn't believe any of these things. In fact, they believed the inverse of all of these things. Just to take one, man's aim in life is happiness. Well, that wasn't believed by our forefathers. Our aim in life, traditionally, on a spiritual basis, on a scriptural basis, and I'm sure it's not just to do with the monotheistic religions, but more broadly speaking, was that to serve God and to fulfill one's duty to God. That was the whole duty of man. If at the end of Ecclesiastes, let us hear the conclusion of the whole matter. Fear God and keep his commandments, for this is the whole duty of man. That was what they believed, and so did people who didn't read those particular scriptures. They believed that. I could go through the list, but I'm not going to do that now. So what is propaganda? What kind of propaganda is there? So this is basically I'm just sort of rehashing what you need to know to get the rest of it ready. So there are basically three bands of propaganda, and the first one is what Yalul calls pre-propaganda. So pre-propaganda is school and all of that. It is propaganda, and I'll get perhaps into why it's propaganda. There's something called integral propaganda. Integral propaganda or integrated propaganda is what you don't notice probably, and music, films, corporate culture. These are all forming your worldview, but it's not the last form of propaganda, which is what was famously known in the Soviet times, and I have a bit of an interest in that because I happen to live in Russia, and I have a degree in Russian and all the rest of it, as I keep saying, is agitprop, is what that was called, and agitation propaganda. So I'll just give you two explicit examples that you can't have failed to have noticed. Perhaps you wouldn't have recognized it as this, but you know about them. In recent times, the first one is the COVID rollout. Now, this was an agitprop campaign to get you to do something that you wouldn't normally do, to allow yourself to be injected with something in a situation where you had absolutely no recourse in the event that whatever it is they were putting into you didn't have the effect that they claimed to have. Okay, not going to get into the rights and wrongs of all of that right now. I'm just saying that was a propaganda agitprop. You lived through it. If you lived in the West, in fact, all over the world, people were walking around with face mappies on, clapping nurses, and standing 15 feet away from their grandmother, unless it was the second full moon after Lent or Epiphany or whatever it was. it was a crazy religion training you to obey, and that's, to conform, to comport with what the agenda was. And you've been living through these line items all of your life. You've just probably never noticed it consciously. You've felt forms of resistance, or you don't like something, but you just kind of go along with it, mainly because this is you're living in like a goldfish lives in water. You living in a propaganda water. The goldfish doesn't notice the water. Propaganda, if it's effective, you don't notice it. Sometimes the problem is with agitprop is it becomes noticeable. And the second example, which we're living through now, is Putin's unprovoked war of aggression. Now, if you haven't heard that term, I'd be very surprised. So that's an agitprop, thing that you're living through. So, they want to have a war. I'm not going to discuss in this talk the rights and wrongs of that war, but your job is, if you live in the West, is to clap like a trained seal, get a flag for Ukraine. If you have a flag supporting Ukraine, and you can't name me 5 facts about Ukraine, okay, then you've just totally propagandized. That's just the fact. Anyway, I don't suppose you like it, but there it is. So let's read. Blah blah. Where do we start? We start on the right page, which is page 9. Yes. So this section of this larger section is called total propaganda. To begin, propaganda must be total. The propagandist must utilize all of the technical means at his disposal: the press, radio, TV, movies, posters, meetings, door-to-door canvassing. Remember, this was written in 1964-65. Modern propaganda must utilize all these media. There is no propaganda as long as one makes use in sporadic fashion and at random of a newspaper article here, a poster or a radio program there, or organizes a few meetings and lectures, writes a few slogans on walls. That is not propaganda. Each usable medium has its own particular way of penetration. And penetration, this is a propaganda term. I mean, I have mentioned this before. I just happen to have a background in this. I've worked, a number of backgrounds, but I happen to work in public relations for a couple of years at a high level. I just kind of fluked my way into a very high level job, and then I had to work out what it was we did. And so I did. And I became interested in this because I'd noticed it anyway, but it gave me a kind of a framework within which I could then break it down and then study it and then perhaps explain it, I hope, in some way to other people. And you need to know this because, why do you need to know? Well, you need to know it because, if you don't believe in God in the last day, well, then it doesn't really matter. You're kind of toast anyway. But if you do believe in God in the last day, then you will understand that what you believe is central. What they can kill you. You can go to Epictetus, for example. You can chain his leg to the post, but you can't make him hate it. They can destroy the body, but they can't. You should fear God, who can destroy the soul. And so the destruction of the soul is really to do with what you believe. And I'm not talking about what you claim to believe. I mean what you actually believe, and you can tell what you actually believe because what you do is a function of that. You see, so if you actually believe a lie, or enough of them, within a believing context, then that can take you to hell forever, and that's why it's important. So my philosophy is, rather than giving a man a fish, I'm trying to teach him to fish, because one day I'm not going to be here, but if you can fish, you can feed yourself and hopefully feed other people. So that's really the purpose of this. Each usable medium has its own particular way of penetration, and penetration is a public relations form of part of its nomenclature. Specific, but at the same time localized and limited. By itself, it cannot attack the individual, break down his resistance, and make his decisions for him. Cannot attack the individual. This is a military term. Break down his resistance, again, military, and make his decisions for him. This is what propaganda does. That's its purpose. Okay. Now, I'm not here going, "Ooh, isn't it terrible, this propaganda?" I'm saying propaganda has to exist. It's a necessary part of technique. It's the second pillar upon which the lintel rests. technique and propaganda, they go hand in hand. But the point here is that just one thing, a article, as it were, a program, this or that isn't going to do it. It works as a symphony. And in propaganda terms, in propaganda speak, it's called a campaign. If you know anything about how, for example, sort of some software frameworks work. If you know, I'm just thinking off the top of my head, something called Flutter. The way that Flutter works, it basically works on a tree. So you've got dependencies, but it all goes to a kind of an original root of that tree of dependencies. Well, any taxonomy works like this. Or if you want to put it in other terms, if you've used a Word document and you start with, if you're using bullets, and then you indent and you write some more bullets, and you indent and write some more bullets, and you indent and write some more bullets, it all basically goes back to one bullet. Okay, well this would be kind of how it works, in the sense that what they're trying to do is to change your root folder, and that is your worldview. That's what effective propaganda does, and it can't do it just by sort of piecemeal work. It has to be fully coordinated like a symphony. All right, it's not just throwing out a few notes here and there. It has to have a policy, a plan, and believe me, it always does. It always has. You've been living in it all your life. I'm just trying to unpick the matrix a little bit. And again, going back to what they're talking about here, what the Ilul is talking about is that there has to be a range, a suite of tools which are used. You can't just have a jingle on a radio program. You have to have an entire system of it, a complex, for it to be effective. In fact, it has to be total. And you think to yourself, well, then it would mean that somebody has to be orchestrating all of this, blah, 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 conspiracy theories, I don't believe in them. Have you ever worked in a big company? If you've worked in a large company, you know that at the top of the company, there is a decision. That decision has been made. Now, you will go through a kind of a farce of pretending to ask people for their opinions. This is democracy, right? This is the kind of the democracy level. But you all know that it's nonsense. What actually happens is that the strong-willed and the independent and the difficult, be people like me, they leave. And the compliant and the frightened and the weak, they stay and they obey. You see, that's how it works. Well, this is how this works. Exactly the same. I just want to use George Bush here, just to kind of put a little bit of meat onto the bones of this idea of it being an orchestrated thing. He used the term 1,000 points of light. I think he used it more than once. And it's actually a quote from a couple of books, which is not relevant here. But this expresses the full spectrum propaganda's full spectrum quality that propaganda requires in order to operate. Okay? A point that I've made a couple of times to do with Soviet propaganda, for example, is that the idea of criticism. Well, in the propaganda Soviet system, the propaganda system in the Soviet Union, it was total, and you could criticize it. For example, you could write a letter, as I've said in other talks, to the newspaper, to Pravda or Izvestia, and say, "Oh dear, this thing has happened in our town. They're not painting the benches in the courtyard, or the buses aren't running on time, or something, from outraged in Yaroslavl or whatever it was." You could do that. Of course you could. But what you couldn't do was discuss the idea that perhaps the Soviet system per se was at fault here. That you could not do. And if you may have noticed in the West, there are a whole series of things you can't talk about. These things are agenda items, whatever it is, so-called, equality, or, LGBT, or whatever it is, the whole list of things which you did not vote for. Would never even have occurred to you in a normal state. In fact, your grandparents would have looked at it and been aghast, if not actually vomited, on the street. So, but these things you cannot challenge. These things are an agenda item. Anyway, I'll get on with it and perhaps get to that in the second half. A movie does not play on the same motives, does not produce the same feelings, does not provoke the same reactions as a newspaper. The very fact that the effectiveness of each medium is limited to one particular area clearly shows the necessity of complementing it with other media. It has to be a broad spectrum campaign. A word spoken on the radio is not the same, does not produce the same effect, it does not have the same impact as the identical word spoken in private conversation or in a public speech before a large crowd. So the medium is the message to some extent, or to some large extent. To draw the individual into the net of propaganda, each technique must be utilized in its own specific way, directed towards producing the effect it can best produce and fused with all the other media, each of them reaching the individual in a specific fashion and making him react anew to the same theme in the same direction, but differently. And this is me speaking now, this is why, quote unquote, democracy, and if you don't know me, you may not know that I'm very sceptical. I rather mock the idea of democracy. I'm not going to get into all the reasons, but we'll just hit a couple of points now. This is why democracy is meaningless. I mean, all right, I'm going to control myself. I'm not going to go there. Firstly, because it's predicated on the presupposition of technique. And I listed those earlier, all of which are actually erroneous, or at least if you don't agree with that, our forefathers didn't accept any of them, and I certainly don't accept any of them. And B, it pretends that people's minds are their own, which they're not. But you can see, I mean, propaganda just... I'm straining at the leash here. Propaganda, democracy is a propaganda term. If you believe you have it, or you believe it's a good thing, or you believe it's somehow implicitly, inherently real, that's a function of propaganda. It really is. We'll see that to be effective, propaganda must be total, which is what we're really looking at here. Therefore, coordinated. And so what you'll see is that only certain types of journalists and writers, etc., are promoted. And that they self-censor. Again, I worked in public relations, it was 2 or 3 years, I can't remember. And you deal with journalists all the time, and you find there's a bit of a revolving door, certainly in the area I worked in, where you'll deal with journalists who work for newspaper or television, whatever it is, company X, and then they'll come in-house and work for a while and then go out of house. So there's this whole network of people, and they all know how the game works. And especially with journalists, I wouldn't say it's the same with Russian. It depends on the kind of person. Russian journalists are a lot more unruly, I would say. Western journalists, I have a very low opinion of them. I'll put it that way. They seem to be the more kind of spiritually aware ones. Actually. Had contempt for themselves. At least they had that much. The rest are just beyond the pale, beyond help. And so, when talking about the self-censor and this what happens in this kind of this culture which accrues to any company. I mean, certainly if you take Western media, for example, they're all pretty much owned by the same kinds of people. But as I say, and those companies, it's kind of a toothpaste choice. You've got Procter & Gamble or Lever Brothers who own all of the toothpaste companies, and so there is no real, diversity. This thing that they say they want, you don't have it. There's uniformity of acceptance of all of the agenda items. They're going to just describe it in different. They're going to describe the same thing but in different different ways. So the way the Daily Mail might describe something is going to be different to the way that the Wall Street Journal is going to describe it. But they absolutely agree. If you want to know what the agenda is, just look at what they all agree upon. And there you are. That's the agenda. So that's that. And then you see that what happens, as I mentioned, in corporate culture, for example, a bit earlier, that people, they weed out the good people, and the people who remain are obedient. They don't need to be controlled because they're there. They know that they probably haven't thought about it, but they intuit that their primary qualification, I mean, they have to have other qualifications too, but is obedience to a worldview. I'll give you an example of where you've seen this in very recent time, which would be the rollout of the COVID agenda, which was a beta test. It'll be back. They're kind of keeping it there on the back boiler. They're trying to get through the Ukraine thing first, but that will be coming back. It will be coming back. But this time, all of the good policemen, all of the good nurses, all of the good doctors, all of those people who had a backbone and some actual strength and something about them, they've all left. You may have noticed they've gone. So who's left? It's the people who are too weak or too indebted to be able to leave, but who will crucially compromise any conscience they may potentially have had next time in order to start jabbing you lot. You see, that's how it works. It's not very complicated. Anyway, I'm going to wrap that bit up there for my YouTube, Rumble, whatever the other one's called, thing. And after this short announcement, I will be continuing for my paid Substack subscribers. So, briefly, details of where I upload to, how you can join my Substack and Telegram channel, support my work and download my books free are in the description. Thanks for listening, and bye for now.